is a real privilege. We had put out feelers to see if David Swanson could join us again this year, but as you know, he's in great demand and apparently had to promise his wife that one away speaking engagement a month might be enough at the moment. And he said, I highly recommend that you invite Greta Zarro, who is working for us as the chief organizer for World Beyond War. And I'm so happy that we did, and I'm so eager to welcome her to this gathering. It's so wonderful to see a young face among us, and I think just that alone gives us, Greta, great hope. Greta has a background in issue-based community organizing. Her experience includes volunteer recruitment and engagement, event organizing, coalition building, legislative and media outreach, and public speaking. She's interested in the interconnections of social ecological systems and sees the profligacy of the military, industrial, academic, media complex as part of the larger corporatocracy, as the root of many cultural and environmental ills. She and her partner currently live in an off-grid tiny home on their organic fruit and vegetable farm in upstate New York. And we are so happy that Greta has traveled here from World Beyond War. And thank you so much, Greta, for joining us.
Hi, welcome. My name is Greta Zarro, and as Maureen said, I'm an organic farmer in West Edmiston in Otsego County, about an hour and a half from here. And I'm the organizing director for World Beyond War. I want to thank Maureen and John for inviting me and World Beyond War to participate in this special 20th anniversary of the Kateri conference. Founded in 2014, World Beyond War is a decentralized, global, grassroots network of volunteers, activists, and allied organizations advocating for the very abolition of the institution of war at large and its replacement with a culture of peace. Our work follows a two-pronged approach, I like to call it, the peace education component, and then once you have that education, the advocacy, the direct action organizing, putting that into action. Over 75,000 people from 173 countries worldwide have signed our Declaration of Peace, which we're really excited about, and we're trying to reach all of the countries around the world. I'm passing around, like I said, the Declaration of Peace now, so you can join those 75,000 in signing it, which by signing it, you're agreeing to what all of you are already doing, really, by being here, which is working non-violently for the end of war. Our work tackles the myths of war by illustrating that war is not necessary, not beneficial, and not inevitable. Our book, online courses, webinars, articles, and other resources make the case for an alternative global security system, basically a new form of global governance, one that is based on peace and demilitarization. This year's Kateri conference theme, Martin Luther King's harbinger about the fierce urgency of now, really resonated with me, and I think it's a very timely message, which I'll talk about later. Building off of the theme today, I am tasked, Maureen asked me to talk about the social and ecological imperatives of war abolition, a great topic that I hope I'll get into a little bit and hope we have time for discussion as well. This fits well with World Beyond War's work because what is unique about our approach is the way in which we really illustrate how the war system, as I said last night, is truly the nexus of these issues that we're facing as a species and as a planet. War and ongoing preparations for war tie up trillions with a T, of dollars that could be reallocated to social and ecological initiatives, such as healthcare, education, clean water, infrastructure, the just transition to renewable energy, livable wages for everyone, and many more initiatives. In fact, some of you have seen our billboard, which really illustrates this message, and some of you work with us to get up billboards in Syracuse and Albany, which say 3% of US military spending could be used to end starvation on Earth. That's hard to imagine. With the US government spending a combined $1 trillion annually on war and preparations for war, including the stationing of troops in over 800 bases across the world, there is little left of the public purse to spend on domestic necessities. The American Society of Civil Engineers ranks the U.S. infrastructure a D+. The U.S. ranks 4th in the world for wealth inequality, according to the OECD. U.S. infant mortality rates are the highest in the developed world, according to the UN Special Rapporteur Philip Alston. And as we know, communities across this nation, particularly highlighted here in New York in Hoosick Falls and in Newburgh, and we've seen in Flint, Michigan, are lacking clean access to drinking water and sanitation, which is a UN human right that was passed several years ago as a UN human right that the US is failing to uphold. And 40 million Americans live below the poverty line. Given this lack of a basic social safety net, is it any wonder that people enlist in the armed forces for economic relief and a supposed sense of purpose grounded in our nation's history of associating military service with heroism? So if we want to make progress on any of these progressive issues that we as activists are advocating for, the elephant in the room is the war system. A system that is perpetuated at this massive scale because of the very fact that it is profitable for our government, for corporations, and for elected officials who take bribes to perpetuate the cycle. Dollar for dollar, studies show that in fact we would have more jobs and better paying jobs in any other industry except the war industry if we reallocated that money. And like I said, it's a cycle because while our society remains based on a war economy, government military spending is in fact increasing economic inequality because you're taking public dollars and you're investing it in privatized industries, further concentrating the wealth in a small number of hands. Now, beyond this issue of profitability and reallocation of funds, the connections between the war system and social and ecological impacts go much deeper, and so I'm going to go into now some concrete statistics about these societal and ecological impacts. All right, let's start with how war threatens the environment. The US Department of Energy, its own estimates, reveal that in 2016, the Department of Defense emitted more than 66.2 million metric tons of CO2. This is more than the emissions of 160 other nations combined. The Department of Defense's emissions versus 160 other nations combined. Along with that, obviously, one of the world's top consumers of oil is the US military. This is an interesting fact that I like to cite. The US military is the third largest polluter of US waterways, rivers, lakes, streams, etc. Current or former military-related installations, which basically means military bases, form a high proportion of the 1,300 Superfund sites that the EPA designates as hazardous sites. But despite these well-documented harms that militarism causes to the environment, ironically, the Pentagon, many other agencies, and also various military industries and corporations are exempted from environmental regulations that other industries have to follow. Now, in terms of the social impacts of the war machine, I want to focus specifically on the ways in which war and ongoing preparations for war have deep negative ramifications for the residents of the attacking or warmongering country, in this case, the US. Because I think we can all agree that the societal impact of war on the victimized countries is enormous, horrendous, immoral, and a violation of international law and human rights. So we've got that down. We know it's destroying other countries, but what is it doing to our society as well? It is this secondary impact on the home country, the country waging war, that I think is less talked about in general, and that has the potential to broaden the reach of the war abolition movement. What I'm referring to is the way in which our country's perpetual state of warfare has, number one, led to a permanent surveillance state, similar to what Ray has been talking about, one in which US citizens' rights to privacy are just brushed off in the name of national security. Number two, a highly militarized domestic police force that receives surplus military equipment far beyond what is necessary for the police to supposedly protect our communities. Number three, we're left with a culture of war and violence here at home, which invades our lives through video games and Hollywood films, for example, many of which are funded, censored, and scripted by the US military to portray violence in a heroic light. Number four, increased racism and xenophobia towards the other, the enemy, which not only impacts our perceptions of countries like North Korea and Afghanistan, as Anne Wright was talking about, but also impacts our perceptions of immigrants here in the United States. And number five, a normalization of military recruitment in our schools, in our public school system. And in particular, I'm talking about the JROTC program, which sort of came to light this spring with the horrific Valentine Day massacre in Florida, where the student had been trained in his own high school gymnasium by the US military in a school-sanctioned program how to shoot a weapon, a lethal weapon, and then he used that on his fellow students. And on top of all this, which is hard to imagine, he was wearing a JROTC t-shirt as he was committing the massacre. So, what I have laid out really illustrates, in my mind, how militarism is embedded in our social structure. And this culture of warfare is justified in the name of national security, which is used to excuse torture, assassinations, imprisonments, and the violation of international law. And this facade of national security is especially ironic, given, for example, that the Global Terrorism Index shows that there has been a steady increase in terrorism since the war on terror started. We've actually created more resentment, hatred, and blowback. And federal intelligence analysts and former military officers will admit this. And if you go on our website, you can see many, many quotes from former government officials who are admitting this isn't working. This is actually causing more terrorism. According to a declassified intelligence report on the war on Iraq, quote, despite serious damage to the leadership of Al-Qaeda, the threat from Islamic extremists has spread in both numbers and in geographic reach since the beginning of the intervention. As someone who was a former environmental community organizer based in Brooklyn, I used to work for Food and Water Watch. I highly recommend them and look them up. You should look them up as well. One thing that I did not see is I did not see those interconnections being made between the military system that we've been talking about and these social and ecological impacts. These connections between activist groups I saw in my experience were just not being made, not being talked about. I think there can be a tendency in the movement to stay within our issue silos, I call them. Whether our passion is opposing fracking or GMOs or war or advocating for healthcare or education. But by staying in these silos, we impede progress as a unified mass movement. Now, this echoes of the criticism of identity politics that really played out in the 2016 election cycle, where people were split up into their various identity categories, and really that unifying message of social, ecological, and environmental justice was missing from the dialogue. Because what we're talking about, really, when we advocate for any of these issues, is a restructuring of society. A paradigmatic shift away from corporate capitalism and empire building. A reorientation of government spending and priorities, which are currently focused on maintaining global economic and political hegemony at the expense of the safety, human rights, and civil liberties of people abroad and at home, and to the detriment of the environment. This year, the 50th anniversary of MLK's assassination, we did witness a breaking down of these activism silos with a revival of the Poor People's Campaign. And some of us talked about this yesterday. I know one person was wearing a Poor People's Campaign t-shirt. And I think this is why this conference theme is so relevant, because of this ongoing revival just this year. The Poor People's Campaign does signal a hopeful directional shift in the movement towards fusion organizing, or what I call intersectional activism. We saw with the 40 Days of Action this spring all kinds of groups, from national environmental organizations like Food and Water Watch and Greenpeace, to LGBT groups, to social justice organizations, unions, and of course anti-war organizations, coming together around these three evils, as MLK calls them: militarism, poverty, and racism. Now, what these cross-connections help to establish is the fact that war is not an issue to be opposed on a case-by-case basis, which we sort of saw that happen with the Iraq War, where we had these massive protests, and then once the issue wasn't trending anymore in the news, it just died away. Rather, what MLK's framework of the three evils makes clear is my point about how war is the nexus of these social and ecological ills, and that war is the foundation upon which US policies across the board are currently built. Key to World Beyond War's work is this holistic opposition to the institution of war at large. Not only all current wars and violent conflicts, but the industry of war itself. The ongoing preparations of war that feed the profitability of the system itself, such as arms manufacturing, weapons stockpiling, the military bases we already referenced. Now, this brings me to the final section of my presentation, the where do we go from here? Okay, I'm good on time. Hopefully we'll have time for questions. So, if we want to undermine the institution of war, there are a number of needed action steps to cut off the war machine at its source. And this is what I call withdrawing the people, withdrawing the profits, and withdrawing the infrastructure. So, number one, withdrawing the people, and by this I mean countering the military recruitment by advocating for increased transparency and expanded avenues for opting out of military recruitment. In this country, parents legally have the right to opt their children out of military recruitment. But this is something that most parents do not even know. I didn't know it until I got involved in this work, because most parents are not properly informed of this right by their schools. And so instead, the Pentagon automatically collects the private information, the names and contact information for all of these children. You know, when I was 18, the Pentagon called me and I said, well, I'm a peace activist, and they hung up the phone. Only the state of Maryland has a good law on the books that informs parents of this right to opt out. So in Maryland, each year the parents get a form and they have to check a box. Do you want to opt them in or opt them out? But that's the only state that does that. The counter-recruitment campaign is also targeted at passing state-level legislation to close those JROTC programs that I talked about earlier. In fact, in New York, it was very exciting this year in New York State because Assemblywoman Linda Rosenthal from New York City actually introduced legislation to ban the JROTC school marksmanship programs. And that was really, I think, a result of that Florida shooting that really brought those programs to light. So we need to advocate for her to reintroduce that legislation next session. It didn't get a lot of traction. I think it was in May or June when she introduced it anyway. So we need to advocate for the reintroduction of that legislation next session and getting more assembly members and also getting an alternative version in the state Senate to advocate for. Okay. Number two, withdraw the profits. So I've covered withdraw the people, counter-recruitment. Number two, withdraw the profits. Now by this, I'm referring to war divestment, which means divesting public pension funds, retirement savings, 401k plans, 403b plans, university endowments, and other state-owned, municipal, institutional, or personal funds from companies that invest in military contractors and weapons manufacturers. I'll tell a small side story that's not in my notes. When I was working for Food and Water Watch, we had a 403B plan. And that was invested in Vanguard, which is one of the largest mutual fund institutions. And probably unknowingly, as many of us are unwitting supporters in this system that is so complex that we don't even realize we're propping it up, that money was actually going to finance weapon contractors and arms manufacturers, because Vanguard reinvests that money in those companies to make a profit. So I personally divested my funds, and I encourage you to look into where your money is invested, because sort of through the 6 degrees of separation, you may actually be invested in these weapons companies. And you can visit worldbeyondwar.org/divest to use what's called the Weapon Free Funds database. And this is something that was created by Code Pink and a company called As You Sow, S-O-W. And they create many of these databases where you can look at your mutual fund companies and see if they're invested in war, if they're invested in fossil fuels, and various other negative things, and also look for alternatives. They have a whole ranking system, and you can see what gets a green check or a red X in terms of what to invest in. And I'm not just talking about your personal funds. You know, this really involves anyone, a university, a church group that invests its endowments somewhere, municipalities that invest public pension funds somewhere. So this really affects all of us, whether you have personal savings or not. So the third action step is withdrawing the infrastructure of war, and by this I'm specifically referring to World Beyond War's campaign to close military bases. World Beyond War is a founding member of the Coalition Against U.S. Foreign Military Bases, which was founded in February of this year, and they're planning for their big global conference in Dublin that you might have heard about in November of this year. So this campaign aims to raise public awareness and organize nonviolent mass resistance against military bases worldwide, with particular emphasis on the US, which constitutes 95% of all foreign military bases. Foreign military bases, someone described them once as the pushpins that hold up the map of empire. And I really like that metaphor. Military bases are centers of warmongering and expansionism, causing severe environmental, economic, political, and social and health impacts on local populations that have to host these megacenters, some of which are really large towns, 55,000 US troops. And while the network of US foreign military bases exists, so too will the US remain a threat to other countries, which perpetuates this war system where other countries, as Anne talked about, North Korea, in turn build up their weapons because they feel intact. They are literally invaded by the US. And for this, it is no surprise that in 2013, a Gallup poll, which asked people in 65 countries worldwide, it asked them the question, what country is the greatest threat to peace? And the US was the top answer by people from 65 countries worldwide. And one of the things that David Swanson likes to say in our messaging on our website is, imagine if we reinvested that $1 trillion annually in anything else, such as giving people solar panels, giving people seeds for crops, anything else. That would totally flip it on its head, and the US would be seen as, the greatest peacemaker in the world. So I invite you to partner with World Beyond War to work on any of these campaigns that I've discussed. And really, World Beyond War is a hub for educational materials. Really, I do recommend checking out our website. It's huge, and I find new things on it every day because there's so many links you can click and links from there. So really, it has a lot of educational materials that you can use as sort of the facts that bolster your campaign. And beyond that, we hope to provide organizing assistance to groups. So if you're looking to organize a campaign, an event, that's when you can come to us, and really we'll help you through the process of organizing it, getting the materials, PowerPoints, videos, whatever you need, and then promoting your event. And we team up, like I said, with activists and volunteers, but also with other organizations. And with the Syracuse groups and the Albany groups, we've already done that, where we've teamed up on these joint campaigns. And if you're part of an existing group, we invite you to join the network, and we'll promote you and list you on our website, because we have this huge directory of not all, but many anti-war groups across the world. So it's really a hub where people can find what's happening in their area. So please do reach out if you want to affiliate in a group or start your own World Beyond War chapter if there isn't a chapter in your area. Okay, so I want to conclude with a couple of thoughts about organizing in general and tips for the work ahead. And these are just 3 of my thoughts based on my experience. Number 1, like I've been talking about, work in coalition across disciplines to emphasize the cross connections between these issues that we've been discussing today, and use that intersectionality to build the strength of our movement. Number 2, be strategic. So a common pitfall that I've seen in my work in organizing is not being strategic in the sense of not determining who the proper target is for your campaign. And so when you are hoping to organize a campaign, really start by doing that initial research of who is the target, or what we would call the decision maker, who could actually make the policy change that you're advocating for. And along with that research, and you can really go in depth on this and see, what motivates the target, what are the constituencies that would move that target, who are the secondary targets that that decision maker listens to, who is funding them, who are their connections that you can use to sway them. So doing that initial research. And number 3, and I talked about this with someone yesterday, provide concrete, tangible, positive action steps. As an organizer, I often hear feedback from people who are tired by this negative language of resist Trump, fight this, fight back, and they're really hoping for something more positive. And I also hear feedback from people who are worn out by these endless petitions. I mean, you could really spend all day signing these online petitions or going to protests every single day. And that connects back to my point about being strategic and really choosing who you're targeting and what you're doing and seeing how that would impact change. But also this connects to choosing tactics that allow for tangible change making at the grassroots level. And the example that comes to mind is divestment, as I've already discussed. Because what I see as unique and as really hopeful with the divestment movement is the fact that it is actionable. It is something you can do right now on the personal level, but also, as we discussed, on the institutional level and the municipal level and the state level even. And it allows people to opt out of the negative and reinvest in the positive. So it's that positive angle, I think, that people are craving, because you can reinvest that money for more positive initiatives like renewable energy, for example. And then at the same time, piece by piece, from the grassroots up, divestment is really contributing to a larger system-wide policy shift. So it's got that two-prong aspect of being both personal and actionable, but at the same time, if everyone's doing it on a large scale, you're creating a society-wide shift. And so those are my 3 sort of general tips. And finally, I'll just conclude with a plug for our conference. We're having our annual conference this September 21st, the International Day of Peace, and September 22nd in Toronto, Canada. And you can go to our website, worldbeyondwar.org/NoWar2018. The conference is called No War 2018, to find out more information and view the full speakers list, and we hope to see you there. Yes, I didn't even really talk about the organic farming piece, because I am tasked here today to be representing World Beyond War and sort of the policy angle, but there is also the alternative lifestyle angle to activism, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday in my small group when one of our assignments during the reflection was to envision a world 150 years from now and what it would be like, and I said that in addition to this policy change that we're all working on, protesting our members of Congress, going out to these rallies, there's also the personal lifestyle aspect. And I think that has, in some ways, more potential for impact. And so while we are advocating for the policy change, we need to be looking at our own lifestyles. And especially, I think I've seen amongst my colleagues that are millennials, sort of this shift in, for example, your purchasing choices. We've seen a rise in organic food over the past 25 years. Also, for the first time, we see a growth in farmers from the millennials that are doing organic farmers, an uptick in farmers in the first time in about 100 years or so. So really looking at those choices that you can make. Last night I was talking with someone who was shocked. I don't have a refrigerator. So you can really look and see what appliances do you actually not need. And I think so that's a way, not just advocating for the change from the top, but also from the bottom, really. It's a form of civilian-based defense, CBD, of taking out the cooperation from the very system itself.